Growing up, my life was a constant battle against the shadows of loss and neglect. My mother, the woman who had longed for me so desperately, was taken away the moment I entered this world. Her death during childbirth became the defining tragedy of my existence, a cruel twist of fate that set the tone for my relationship with my father. He never recovered from her passing, and in his eyes, I was a living reminder of the love he had lost. The house we lived in was a shrine to her memory. Her clothes still hung in the closet, her books lined the shelves, and her photographs adorned every wall. It was as if time had frozen the day she left, and I was left to navigate a home filled with the ghost of a woman I would never know. I often found myself sneaking into my parents' room, running my fingers over her belongings, desperate to feel some connection to her. But no matter how hard I tried, I could never bridge the gap between the mother I yearned for and the cold reality of my father's indifference. He was physically present, but emotionally, he was a million miles away. He made sure I was fed, clothed, and sent to school on time, but there was no warmth, no affection, no hugs, no words of encouragement, not even a pat on the back for my achievements. I felt like an outsider in my own home, a stranger living under the same roof as a man who could barely look at me, let alone love me. The few times he did speak to me, it was to criticize or compare me to my cousin, Jake. Jake's father, my uncle, had died in a car accident when Jake was just 7 years old, and my father took him under his wing. I remember the day we got the news about my uncle's death. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, and I was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when the phone rang. My father answered, and I watched as his face crumpled. It was the first and only time I ever saw him cry. After that, Jake became a permanent fixture in our lives. At first, I was excited. I thought having another kid around might make things more fun, maybe even help my father open up a bit. But it didn't take long for me to realize that Jake's presence only made things worse. My father doted on him, praising him for the smallest things while ignoring my accomplishments. Jake was everything I wasn't: sporty, outgoing, and charming. He was the life of the party, while I was shy and introverted, preferring the company of books to people. My father's favoritism was blatant and painful. He would often ask, "Why can't you be more like Jake?" Or say, "Jake would never do that." It was as if Jake was the son he had always wanted, and I was just an afterthought. I tried everything to win my father's approval. I joined every sports team he thought Jake would excel in, even though I had no interest or talent for them. I worked tirelessly to get good grades, hoping that academic success would finally make him proud. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. I remember one particular incident that still haunts me to this day. I was about 12 years old, and I won first place in the science fair with a complicated moving model of the solar system. I had spent weeks working on it, pouring my heart and soul into every detail. I was so excited to show my father, convinced that this would finally make him see me. But when I got home, he was too busy laughing and talking with Jake about a football game to even acknowledge my achievement. I stood there, holding my trophy, feeling invisible. When I finally managed to tell him I had won, he just nodded and went back to his conversation with Jake. It was a crushing blow, a moment that solidified my belief that I would never be good enough in his eyes. As we grew older, the favoritism only became more pronounced. Jake and I were in the same grade, and while I consistently outperformed him academically, my father always found a way to downplay my achievements. During one parent-teacher meeting, my English teacher raved about an essay I had written, calling it one of the best she had ever seen from a student my age. She told my father that she thought I had a bright future as a writer. But instead of praising me, he just grunted and asked if writing would help me get a sports scholarship. The teacher looked confused, and I was left feeling humiliated and unseen. The final straw came when it was time for college. I had worked hard to get into a decent university, but I knew money would be tight. I had hoped my father would at least contribute something, but I was wrong. One day, I overheard him on the phone with Jake, promising to pay for his entire college tuition. My heart sank as I listened to him lavish Jake with support while I stood there, invisible once again. When I asked if he could help me too, he looked at me like I was insane. "Jake needs it more," he said. I can't afford to pay for both of you." Those words shattered me. My dreams of college evaporated in an instant, and I was left to fend for myself. I tried to make it work. I took on a part-time job at a local diner, applied for every scholarship I could find, and juggled classes, work, and studying. But the strain was too much, and after the first semester, I had to drop out. Meanwhile, Jake was living the high life at a prestigious university funded entirely by my father. He posted pictures of his luxurious dorm room, spring break trips, and the new laptop my father had bought him. Every post was a knife to my heart, a reminder of everything I'd been denied. The pain of my father's favoritism was unbearable, but it also fueled my determination to build a life of my own. I may have been the forgotten son, but I refused to let his neglect define me. And as I look back on those years, I realized that his inability to love me had nothing to do with my worth. It was a reflection of his own unresolved grief and shortcomings. I may not have had his approval, but I found strength in my resilience, and that is something no one can ever take away from me. The day I walked out of my father's house was the hardest yet most liberating moment of my life. After years of being overshadowed by Jake, ignored by my father, and drowning in the weight of their favoritism, I knew I had to escape. The final blow came when I realized that no matter how hard I worked or how much I achieved, I would never be enough in my father's eyes. The image of Jake living his dream life, funded by my father's unwavering support, while I struggled to scrape together enough money for community college, was a constant reminder of how little I mattered. I packed my bags that night, leaving behind the house that had never felt like a home, and cut all ties with my father and Jake. The first few months on my own were a whirlwind of chaos and uncertainty. I moved to a new city where no one knew me, determined to start over. With no savings, no degree, and no support system, I took whatever jobs I could find. I cleaned offices during the day, worked as a bartender at night, and even picked up odd jobs on weekends. The exhaustion was relentless. My feet ached, my hands were calloused, and there were nights I came home smelling like grease and beer, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. But I refused to give up. I reminded myself that I had survived a lifetime of neglect, and I could survive this too. One of the lowest points came when I got sick during a brutal winter. I had no health insurance and couldn't afford to take time off work. I remember lying on the floor of my tiny studio apartment, shivering under a thin blanket, and wondering if anyone would even notice if I didn't make it through the night. But even in that moment of despair, I found a flicker of determination. I dragged myself to work the next day, fueled by nothing but sheer willpower and the knowledge that I had no one to fall back on. Slowly, things began to improve. I landed a job as a manager at a local bookstore, a role that felt like a small miracle. Surrounded by books, I found solace in the stories of characters who had overcome their own struggles. It wasn't the glamorous career I had once dreamed of, but it gave me a sense of purpose and stability. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. I also enrolled in night classes at the community college, determined to finish the degree I had been forced to abandon. Balancing work and school was grueling, but I refused to let my past define my future. I studied late into the night after long shifts, fueled by cheap coffee and the burning desire to prove to myself that I could succeed on my own terms. 3 years had passed since I walked away from my father and Jake, and in that time, I had built a life of my own, imperfect but mine. I thought I had left the past behind, but life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. One evening, as I was closing up the bookstore, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, and the voice on the other end sent a chill down my spine. It was my father. His voice was different, older, weaker, and laced with desperation. After some awkward small talk, he got to the point. He needed money, and a lot of it. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was the man who had chosen Jake over me time and time again, who had funded Jake's college tuition, his car, his business ventures, while I struggled to make ends meet. And now he was turning to me for help. At first, I was too stunned to respond. My mind raced with questions. Why me? What about Jake, his golden boy? When I finally found my voice, I asked him exactly that. My father hesitated, then mumbled something about Jake being too busy with his new job and unable to help. I couldn't help but laugh a bitter, hollow sound. After years of being told how much better Jake was, how he deserved every opportunity I was denied, now I was supposed to be the one to bail them out. I made it clear that I wouldn't be his financial savior. I reminded him of all the times I had needed him, not just for college tuition, but for the little moments too. School events, my first heartbreak, learning to drive. He'd been absent then, too wrapped up in Jake's successes to notice me. Now it was his turn to face the consequences of his choices. But curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to dig deeper. I reached out to a few family friends, including Mrs. Peterson, my mother's best friend, and Mr. Johnson, the neighbor who had taught me to drive. What I uncovered was a story of financial ruin and shattered illusions. My father had gone all in on Jake, investing not just in his education but in his dreams. He had taken out loans, maxed out his credit cards, and even remortgaged the house to fund Jake's startup, a tech company that had seemed promising but quickly flopped. Jake, the golden child who could do no wrong, had failed spectacularly. And when my father turned to him for help with the mounting debt, Jake had refused, claiming he couldn't spare anything. The image of my father standing in the driveway, watching Jake drive off in a flashy new car after their argument, was both heartbreaking and infuriating. For years, my father had poured everything into Jake, believing he was investing in a brighter future. But now that future had crumbled and he was left drowning in regret and debt. A part of me felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. After years of being compared to Jake, of being made to feel like I was never enough, the tables had turned. But mostly, I just felt tired of the drama, the pain, and the endless cycle of disappointment. When my father texted me later, apologizing and asking if we could talk, I took my time responding. I acknowledged his apology, but made it clear that words alone couldn't undo years of neglect. I told him I needed time and space, and that I wouldn't be bailing him out financially. His decisions had brought him to this point, just as mine had led me to where I was now. As I sat there staring at my phone, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time, I had stood up for myself against the man who had always made me feel invisible. I wasn't the same desperate kid seeking his approval anymore. I was an adult, building a life on my own terms, and that was something no one could take away from me. The journey to self-acceptance and independence was neither quick nor easy, but it was transformative. After years of living in the shadow of my father's favoritism and Jake's seemingly perfect life, I finally reached a breaking point. The day I walked away from my father's house, I left behind not just a toxic environment, but also the desperate need for his approval. It was a decision born out of pain, but it became the foundation for my growth. As I built my new life, I began to see things more clearly. The favoritism I had endured wasn't about me. It was about my father's unresolved grief and his inability to move past my mother's death. He had poured all his hopes and dreams into Jake, not because Jake was inherently better, but because Jake represented a second chance, a way to rewrite the narrative of loss that had defined our family. Realizing this didn't erase the pain, but it helped me let go of the belief that I was somehow unworthy. The road to self-reliance was fraught with challenges. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering if I had made the right choice. I worked multiple jobs, often juggling 16-hour days just to make ends meet. I lived in a cramped studio apartment, surviving on instant noodles and coffee, and there were moments when I questioned whether I could keep going. But with each small victory, a promotion at the bookstore, a good grade in my night classes, I felt a growing sense of pride. I was doing this on my own, and that meant something. One of the most significant turning points came when I reconnected with Sarah, a friend from high school who had always believed in me. She had been there during my first heartbreak, when my father couldn't even look up from the TV to ask what was wrong. Now she was helping me move into a slightly better apartment, and as we unpacked boxes and arranged furniture, I realized how far I had come. Sarah and my other friends had become my chosen family, a support system that reminded me I wasn't alone. My father's unexpected call for help was another pivotal moment. Hearing his voice after 3 years brought back a flood of emotions: anger, sadness, and even a flicker of that old longing for his approval. But this time, I didn't cave. I stood my ground, refusing to bail him out of the mess he had created. It wasn't easy. There was a part of me that still wanted to fix things, to finally earn his love. But I knew better. I had spent too many years chasing a dream that was never meant for me. Instead, I focused on building a life that was entirely my own. I continued my night classes, determined to earn the degree I had been forced to abandon. I found joy in my work at the bookstore, surrounded by stories that inspired me to keep going. And I nurtured the relationships that mattered, the friends who had stood by me through thick and thin. Looking back, I realized that my father's favoritism had shaped me in unexpected ways. It had taught me resilience, self-reliance, and the importance of surrounding myself with people who truly cared. I no longer needed his approval to feel worthy. I had built a life on my own terms, and for the first time, I felt proud of the person I had become. The future was still uncertain, but I faced it with a newfound sense of confidence. I didn't know if my relationship with my father would ever heal, and I was okay with that. I had found my own path, and that was enough. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that made all the difference.